Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Longhurst, and I'm the managing editor of Daily Meditations from Richard Rohr and the CAC, the Center for Action and Contemplation. And this week, we are featuring meditations inspired by Jewish mystics from Ukraine. I have the great privilege to speak with the scholar Arthur Green as we share this week of meditations with you. And Arthur is a foremost scholar of Jewish Hasidic Mystics. And if you're not familiar with that branch of Judaism, keep watching the video. He's going to explain. Here's a little bit about Arthur before we jump in. He's done a huge amount to educate the world about the gifts of contemplative, mystical Judaism. He has studied with Abraham Joshua Heschel, who some of the readers might be familiar with, who I think we can consider a giant of contemplation and action. He has taught at Brandeis University outside of Boston for many years, and he created a non-denominational rabbinical school at Hebrew College, also outside of Boston. And he is speaking with me now from Israel, and so we're working on about a 7-hour time difference here. Arthur, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and to the readers of these daily meditations.
A great pleasure to be with you. It's a delight, especially because I have read some of Father Rohr's work and see a great deal that we have in common. So it's very nice to be here.
Given the horrific suffering that's taking place in Ukraine, we wanted to focus on highlighting some of the spiritual treasures and contemplative heritage that has come out of the place we now know as Ukraine. And I know that you have studied those spiritual streams for many years. So for readers who might not have ever heard of mystical Hasidic Judaism, can you describe what that is and its emergence as a movement in what we know now as Ukraine?
Yes, of course, there's a lot of history that's gone under the bridge between then and now. Hasidism is a Jewish, you might call it a mystical revival movement. It took place in the 18th century. It's based in a much longer and ancient tradition of Jewish mysticism called Kabbalah. But the Hasidic masters tried to take Kabbalah, which was mainly something that lay in the domain of scholars, in the domain of people who really understood the mystical symbolism of Kabbalah very well. They chose to take it and make it into the basis for a popular movement. So revival means that they tried to rekindle the embers. You know the difference between a reform movement and a revival movement. A reform movement wants to update the forms. A revival movement says the forms are fine, but there's no life in them, so let's relight the fires. And that's exactly what Hasidism did. It tried to reinfuse Judaism with a kind of intensive inward spiritual passion. And it happened in the Ukraine, which was a major area of Jewish population, beginning to the mid to late 18th century. And Hasidism was one of the more successful religious movements in modern times. And it conquered most of East European Jewry. Most of the majority of East European Jews by the middle of the 19th century considered themselves Hasidic. Of course, all of this was viciously wiped out, first by the Soviet repression of religion, but totally by the Nazis, who massacred almost all the Jews in Ukraine. And there's just a very, very tiny Jewish community left there today.
Would you be able to share a couple of the teachers that came out of that period in the 1800s, I believe, and a brief description of their contributions? I'm thinking of the Baal Shem Tov, and then there's a rabbi who you did your thesis on, I believe, that I would love for you to share about as well.
Well, how much time have you got? I could spend a lot of time talking about these people. The Baal Shem Tov, who died in 1760, was a wandering shaman, a wandering healer, who discovered the inner life in a very profound way. He was a mystical teacher who first became famous because he was radically opposed to the typical behavior of mystics in those days, which was extreme ascetic performance, punishing the body, trying to detach oneself from the flesh. And the Baal Shem Tov called for what we would today call a healthier mysticism, a mysticism that accepts the whole self. On when he read Noah entering the ark, it says, "Enter the ark, you and all your household enter the ark." The same Hebrew word for ark also means word. So he said, enter the word with your whole household. Bring your whole self in. Don't leave any part of you outside. And he was I would call him a sort of holistic mystic in some ways. He did not create the movement. The movement was created in his name after he died. And there were many people who were great in that movement. There's a man called the Preacher of Mezrich. The preacher's name was Dov Ber, but he was called the Preacher. And he created a circle of brilliant disciples around himself who really were the bearers of the movement. I've just finished writing a book about one of them called Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Berdichev is a major city in the western Ukraine. Thank God it's been spared in this war so far because it's too far west to be part of the battle. Levi Yitzchak is buried there. And he's a very interesting figure because Heschel was one of his descendants. But Levi Yitzchak was a person who was trained as a mystic and discovered that he really loved people, really loved ordinary people. And the tension between mystical detachment and embrace of ordinary people and their way of life and trying to connect to ordinary people and praise and protect them was the story of his life. So I've just finished a book about him called Defender of the Faithful. And that's going to come out soon. And so he's very much on my mind. The person you're thinking of is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, whom I wrote a book about many years ago, Tormented Master. He was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, lived into the early 19th century. And he was a person who struggled on questions of faith and doubt his whole life and tried to embrace doubt as a part of the path of faith. He understood that every person of faith has days of doubt and days when he feels abandoned by God. And he was such a person himself. And trying to have a notion of faith that was wide enough to embrace those bad days and to embrace those days of doubt and confusion and find sparks of light in them as well. That was his most essential teaching, I'd say.
Wow, sparks of light. That's such a resonant phrase. Really appreciate that. You have edited a book and translated, I believe, Your Word is Fire, about the contemplative prayer of Hasidic Jewish teachers, and we're sharing some from that book in this week's meditations. The readers of these meditations are familiar with Christian contemplative prayer, but not so much Jewish contemplative prayer. So, what's contemplative, from your perspective, about these Hasidic mystics? What's contemplative about their prayer?
Well, they are using prayer as an inward path. The prayer book we have looks like it's a combination of, you might say, praises of God and requests of God. What we call Shevach and Bakasha. First you praise God and then you request of God. But they put both of those aside and understood that prayer was really a guide into the inner life. I'll quote a friend of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz. Koretz is another one of those Ukrainian towns. And he said it in one line. He said, people think you pray to God, and that's not true. But rather, prayer itself is of the divine essence. God is present in the prayer. It's not as though you are praying here and God is listening or not listening somewhere else over there. God is right there in the prayer. And there's a verse in the Psalms, you, O Holy One, dwell amid the prayers of Israel. God is right there in the prayer. And that sense of using prayer as a gateway into the inner life was really what Hasidic prayer was about. And there were instructions on how to do it. They recited all the traditional prayers in the prayer book, but they recited them in new spirit. They recited them in the spirit of using this as a path to inwardness. Now we have ecstatic mystics in Hasidism. Ecstatic mystics, people who have out of the body experiences and jump up and down and get very excited about the presence of God everywhere in the world. And we have contemplatives. I like to say that ecstatics speed up the pace of mind. They're on a high. They're working on high pressure, whereas contemplatives slow down. They're interested in sort of insight that comes with time, with taking a word of prayer and digesting it slowly and coming back with insight there. It's less experiential and more insightful, I would say, contemplative mysticism, as I understand it in Hasidism. The insight you gain is really what's important.
Mm-hmm. That's a helpful distinction, insight and experience, ecstatic and contemplative. As you've already noticed or mentioned, I'm sure there are some resonant themes that are parallel that readers might be recognizing. And one of those is non-dual religion. And so I just wanted to ask as we close about non-dual Judaism, because Father Richard teaches much about non-dual Christianity, about a Christianity that moves towards a consciousness of unity and wholeness of God's presence in the world, instead of a dualistic win-lose, either or way of viewing reality and each other. God's not out there, God is here, right here. And especially in your book, Seek My Face, a Jewish mystical theology, you've written about this. So what is, in summary, a vision of non-dual Judaism from your perspective?
Well, that's why I liked Father Rohr's work so much when I read it, because we have that in common. I've been working toward that kind of non-dual Judaism for a long time. It's there in Hasidism. The early Hasidic masters had a kind of non-dual vision, but they were a little bit afraid of it. And they hid it behind the face of a personalist, God in heaven kind of Judaism. But what they really meant is there is nothing else. There is no place devoid of God. There is no moment. It isn't overflowing to the brim with divine presence. You have to open yourself to it and discover it. And there's a saying in the Talmud, God is the place of the world. The world is not God's place, which means the world exists inside God, and is wholly embraced by God. But you need to discover that. And the path to discovering it is often a long and very slow process. But yes, that's what they meant. God is not an other. We are part of the one. Each of us is a face of the one, which is another face of the ultimate divine face. And we manifest that in our lives as best we can. You know, the most basic moral teaching of Judaism is that the human being is in the divine image. And I'll close quickly with one of my favorite lines from Heschel. Heschel said, "Why is the Torah so concerned with graven images? Why should not making graven images be in the Ten Commandments?" He said, if you answer it like Maimonides did, because God has no body, God has no face, then you would say it's a theological error. But it's not just a theological error the Torah is concerned about. The point is that God has an image. You are God's image. And to make God's image out of anything less than a full, living, breathing human being is to diminish the divine, is to diminish God. The only tool by which you can fashion a divine image is the tool of your entire life. Now, you won't have a hard time translating that into Christian language, I'm sure.
Definitely. God is not other, the whole world. Father Richard refers to it in his recent book, The Universal Christ, as a Christ-soaked world. So I think we can recognize each other in our traditions. So thank you, Arthur, for taking the time to share some of your work and wisdom with us today and the readers of the meditations. Really appreciate it.
Great pleasure to talk to you. God bless. Take care.
God bless.